What do people want more than anything? They want to be seen. They want to be heard. And if you can do that in a authentic, legitimate way, I can't measure the results of what it be. I can't say it will improve by 48%, whatever, but I can't imagine that it wouldn't have a significant impact.
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Marcus Schaller. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about him. 1, he has over 20 years of experience as a marketing strategist, coach, and copywriter. 2, his experience includes creating messaging strategies and campaigns for multiple industries, including B2B, technology, and SaaS. And 3, just to let you know that Marcus isn't all business and a boring guy. His favorite music is hard rock and heavy metal. So maybe we get into some Metallica here today. Marcus Schaller, welcome to Your Intended Message.
Thank you, George, so much for having me. And that is definitely the most unique intro I've had so far on a podcast. I appreciate it.
Glad to do that. It's got to be fun. And yes, just thinking about that, I want to go and put on some Led Zeppelin.
There we go. That's another podcast series we'll talk about in the future.
Marcus, as a marketing specialist, one of your observations is that people don't see their bottlenecks. They don't see what they're missing. And what have you discovered? Because when you come from the specialists, come from the outside, the inside, you can see what they're doing, maybe something right, but you also see what they're missing. What are some of the bottlenecks that you often run into?
Yeah, George, that's a great question to start off with. Depending on the size of the company, of course, can influence where the bottleneck really is. But if you think about a slightly larger organization, one of the most common bottlenecks I see is their own alignment, their own inner alignment, right? On what is our message? What is our intended message for our audience, right? Ultimately, what is it we're trying to communicate in a way that's really relevant to a select group of people, i.e. your audience, your target market? With smaller businesses, solopreneurs, very small, maybe teams, it's not so much an alignment issue, often because it's the individual making those decisions or the CEO in a very small company. But what I see with the bottleneck there is really trying to do too much, right? Trying to be everything to everybody. And that message gets lost because if you're not being specific to a certain group of people with a common problem or a common situation, then we get really broad, right? And then we want to be it gets very generic.
And what that reminds me of is when people, especially entrepreneurs, describe their target audience and they start with the word everyone. Everyone who?
Some of them stop with everyone. They just say everyone.
Which, of course, is a big mistake. It's them not clear, and maybe they're hoping, well, I'll get business somewhere if I'm open for everyone. And that is a mistake with your marketing because, tell us why that is.
Yeah, it's basically, we only have so much time, energy, and money to work with, right? And in order to get a good return on that investment of time, energy, and money, we need to be able to focus it in the areas where we're going to have the greatest impact. And a lot of times, entrepreneurs, companies of all sizes, they go into a market with this weird assumption as if there's no competition, right? Like because they love their product and service, they kind of go at it where people will naturally understand why it's so different, why it's so much better. but they're not actually expressing that, right? The intention is there, but the intended message is not coming through at all, right? That intention isn't coming through the messaging. And it can be very hard for them to make these kinds of decisions that they need to make because it's counterintuitive, right? You're going into a situation where you really do want everybody full stop, right? You just want customers and clients. And to go in at the beginning and say, you know what, we're not going to be able to appeal to everybody. Everybody's getting me, everybody listening is getting inundated with emails and messages and LinkedIn posts and everything every day. Most of it is not relevant to us. And the only way to cut through the noise is to create something that's really, really relevant to a person, right? An individual person, and then scaling that up so that it's relevant to enough people to create a strong enough customer base. And my question to you, George, I mean, you talk to a lot of people, right? You have this podcast, you have your own business. When you're on the consumer side, right, when you're looking through LinkedIn posts or looking through podcast episodes or seeing ads, what do you notice? Do you feel like a lot of these are really geared to you, or does it feel kind of generic? What's your thoughts?
What I'm seeing, Marcus, is that it is too generic. Even, and I'll give you an example here, even as something as simple as people approaching me to be on my podcast. If I see a cut and paste, what looks like a cut and paste to me, where they might not have my name at the beginning of the message, maybe they put it in, or they just did their cut and paste, and they address me as, hey there.
Hey there. Like you've known each other forever.
Did a lot of research to find out my name.
Yeah, I've had a few podcasts of my own, and I've received more than a few of those types of emails. It's so counterproductive because what happens is, especially in larger businesses, but it's starting to seep down into the smaller ones now too, this obsession with scale, right? So you could say, okay, we want to get on a podcast, right? We're going to reach out to these 30 podcast hosts who we feel they really serve our audience. But we don't really have the time to do the research, right? We don't really have time to make something specific to them that it's going to get their attention. So we're just going to talk about how awesome we are and how I'm a thought leader and whatever, right? And it's just flat. So they wind up being able to send a lot of emails very quickly, right? They are efficient in that sense, but it doesn't make any impact. And maybe sometimes they get lucky. So it keeps them pulling the arm of the slot machine, where they well, it worked last time, but it's in the long run, it saves them time, but it just doesn't get them where they're trying to go, which is actually connecting with people and getting their attention.
And Marcus, I'm wondering if people are getting fooled by the parameters of social media. Oh, how many likes did you get? Oh, I got more than you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fooled is an interesting way to say it too. I think we're conditioned, right? It's part of our humanness is to desire validation, social validation. And that, of course, social media platforms are very intentionally designed to tap into that desire, right? And it becomes a numbers game in the wrong way, right? We think about if I post something and I only got 3 likes and 1 comment, that means automatically it's inferior to what I wrote last week that got 20 likes and 10 comments. That's not true. But we're not wired to think in terms of probability. We're not wired to be able to understand big numbers or nuances like that. We just see it gets a like and we feel good, right? And ultimately that can creep into your point. We get fooled into that's the way to actually deal with stuff, right? It's that's actually a way to create messaging. It's always this kind of real-time voting mechanism, right? As opposed to, if you think about even the posts you put out, if you put out this episode, right, you might get a lot of likes. That would be wonderful, right? Now I'm certainly going to comment on it, but how do we know those likes are actually the people that you're trying to reach? So there's a lot of nuance, but that isn't necessarily something that people get to right away. We just see the numbers and we go, oh, that feels good. Let's do that again.
Marcus, where inside the company do we define who that ideal customer is?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, going back to the size, right? So let's start with the easiest, which is a solopreneur, a very small business, right? Ultimately, the founder, team, individual, co-founders, what have you, have to make that decision. They have to lead. And that decision of ideal customer really is kind of it's baked into the mission of the business. It should be to some degree, especially when it's small, right? You don't have 17 product lines at that point, at least hopefully you don't. And that really needs to be kind of baked into the entire premise of the business, right? Who we're here to serve and the specific problems we're here to help them solve, right? As a company gets bigger, of course, it gets more complicated and you have more product lines and services and different things competing. Then ultimately, it might come from, like, let's say the marketing leadership or the revenue leadership of the CMO or the CRO. But even if it does come from them, it has to be in integrity with the C-suite, with the rest of the C-suite, the CEO and CFO. Like, everybody has to be on board with that. Because if there's lack of alignment, it's going to show up and it's going to create confusion for the people in the organization that are tasked with executing on these, directives. And so that alignment across the board on the highest level of the company is really important, regardless of whose idea it is to focus on one target audience or another.
And I, at one time, used to believe that the best marketing is outstanding customer service. And I'm wondering, do you see a challenge with the marketing thrust focus aligning with what customer service is doing and who customer service is serving and how they serve them?
Yeah, it brings up a couple of points to consider. One is that you correctly identified marketing and customer services being related, right? So sometimes I'll talk to somebody about marketing and they'll say, "Oh, we don't do marketing." And I'm like, "Wait a minute." "Oh, we don't do, everything's relationships, or we do speaking." I'm like, I'm not going to argue with them because there's no point, right? But ultimately, that's all marketing, right? That's all marketing is, like, again, baked into the fundamentals of what you're doing as a business, right? Customer service being part of that. So I just wanted to highlight that your customer service after the fact is a part of your marketing philosophy. How do we serve our customers even once they've paid for it, right? And how do we do that in a way that retains them longer, that leads to referrals, all that other good stuff. And there can be sometimes a disconnect or a tension or a kind of paradox where you have a conflict between the marketing and sales revenue side of things and then the customer success team or customer relationship, where you have people on the front end promising things, maybe. I know nobody listening to this does that because that would be kind of unethical, but it happens, where they'll promise things that aren't really achievable or aren't sustainable. And then customer service as a function, whether it's the individual entrepreneur doing everything or whether it's a separate team, then has to really clean up the mess. And then is kind of maybe judged harshly for not converting as much or not retaining as many of the customers. There's a drop off from the customer first buying to staying. Again, it goes back to the alignment issue, right? Everybody needs to be aligned because the customer journey doesn't end the moment they put their credit card through, right? The customer journey never really ends, even once they left, because you still want to try to get them back.
How do we fix that internal alignment?
There's a few ways to approach it. One way is technologically. I've seen a lot of, now with AI especially, there's a lot of companies out there, SaaS companies, that their primary mission is helping solve these internal alignment bottlenecks that happen from silos, right? Siloed information. So a lot of times, especially the more complex a company gets, people in customer service or customer success don't know what's happening at the beginning. They don't know what the salesperson or especially with very bespoke products or services. They don't know what was created or promised at the beginning. And so they're asking the same questions over and over again for a customer that's already gone through that issue, right? Or even on a customer service call 2 months after the fact, that there's not like a lot of that data is not readily available right there the way you need it, so that there's that streamlined kind of frictionless flow. So there's the technology part of it. And then there's a cultural part of it, right? There's a cultural part of it where it's like, look, if everybody's in silos, in cultural silos, and there's not somebody from each department with a seat at the table for understanding what is the strategic direction of this company, why are we selling this and not that, then all this becomes, as you've seen, I'm sure, this kind of department against department thing, right? And so there's a lot of levels that it has to happen, but ultimately everything is systemic. And unfortunately, when you have a company that grows, sometimes it just kind of grows like weeds, where it's not like they take a step back and understand the systems element of it. They just kind of go, now we have customer success. Okay, cool. Put them in that part of the building. And the addition of teams and different functions don't necessarily translate into new operation systems and protocols for managing all the information between them.
Now, I imagine that one of the causes of internal silos and fighting is different compensation systems.
Ooh, yeah, I agree.
Sales gets compensated for closing a new deal. Purchasing gets compensating for reducing costs year over year, and marketing just gets compensated for creating programs.
Yeah, you see this a lot. I mean, I spend most of my time on the marketing and sales side, not as really the procurement or even the customer success side. So that's where I'm most familiar. And you see that a lot with the marketing and sales team dynamic, and it's changed, right? So, back in the day when marketing was primarily thought of as branding or advertising, right? And it was very hard to measure success in a branding campaign, right? We just didn't have, it's just, how do you know that ad worked? Who knows, right? And that's changed, of course, with digital marketing and the way that so many of these programs can be, or so many of these campaigns can be tracked and measured. So you had in sales going like, hey, if we don't hit our quota, we don't get our bonuses. We might even lose our jobs. And marketing's over there just coming up with, cute brochures or whatever they're creating back in the day. And, nothing falls on them. They don't have any skin in the game. And I think that was creating some tension. And now more recently, you're seeing with marketing, their compensation is, sometimes directly connected to, let's say, even closing rates, which then angers the marketing people because they're going, wait a minute, we focused on creating all these leads. It's not our fault if the sales team over there, So yes, the compensation, and more so even than just how much they get paid, is how they're measured in their performance of whether they keep their jobs. That's something that's very complicated.
Do you see branding as still a relevant icon we should worship?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot lately about branding and how it compares to direct marketing, which is like kind of the two functions that we can think of, right? So if you think about ads on a website, that's a leftover from this direct marketing age where direct mail, everything was measured, right? Somebody either replies or they don't, and who it was. Branding is something that now there's so much talk about personal branding, right? Even as individuals, whether you're an entrepreneur or if you're just building your career. And it's not an either or. And ultimately, your brand is not really up to you. We can design what we want our brand to convey. Again, your intended message of your brand can be something we sit down and we design, and this is our intention of what we want to communicate. But ultimately, the brand is how your audience and how your customer base sees your company, right? So a lot of that can go sideways, as we've seen in many, many cases and over the years. I think they're as a function, they're different kind of approaches to it. So some people are better at branding than they are direct marketing or this kind of analytical marketing. but I think the essence of both are important. So you're thinking in terms of, even if we're using direct marketing approaches where everything is measurable, we still want to think and understand, what is our brand and what are we putting across? And is it consistent on our side? Is the intention consistent, so that ultimately we're increasing as much as possible the potential that it's going to be perceived the way we hope it will be, as opposed to just this kind of random throwing stuff at a wall. And then you have a bunch of people that have very different ideas of what the brand even means.
Let's address the question of just throwing stuff out there. This month we're gonna focus on social media, and then next month we're gonna actually even go deeper on TikTok, and then the month after that we're gonna be producing videos because that's the way to go. And then the month after that we want to get our people on podcasts. How does one decide which way to go, and how many directions should we be going in?
Oh, another really good question, George. Again, depending on the situation, I think the mistake is, let's start with what not to do, in my humble opinion. What not to do is to constantly chase every new shiny object. Now, I think in terms of smaller businesses, that tends to be where my head's at. That's the clients that I tend to work with as a coach. So it's like, I'm thinking in terms of you're one or two people, or maybe even 5 or 6. It's a small team. You only have so much, again, resources, time, energy, money. The other thing to think about too is that not only does it spread you out too thin trying to do everything, which is just it's a math equation at that point. If you think about, as a solopreneur or an entrepreneur with a small team, there's certain things that you have certain talents at. You have a background in radio. It makes perfect sense that you would do a podcast. It would be ridiculous for you not to, right? Now, would it make sense for you to do something that, let's say TikTok, and I'm not sure if you're on TikTok, but let's say you don't really like being on social media. You don't like TikTok. You don't enjoy it. You don't consume it. You don't scroll through it every day. Does that make sense to use? Probably not. So I think it really starts with the person running the business, if it's a small business, and even with a larger company, do you have the staff? Do you have the team to be able to support multiple? They're going off into multiple directions. And it's kind of that classic problem where there's no actual focus and they're not really getting any impact. And then, of course, you have to integrate that with, like, where's your audience, right? So if it turns out that you find out that, let's say you personally don't like using YouTube. I know that's not true, but let's say you don't like YouTube, but you find out that that's where the majority of your potential is. You might have to just figure it out, right? But I think it really starts with, like, go with your strengths, because there's certain things that we're just good at. And why wouldn't we leverage that as much as possible?
The challenge of getting everyone aligned. Let's look at a medium-sized company, medium to large-sized company. How can they better align people, not only the sales and marketing people, but other parts of the organization? And I'll give you an example that I just saw on the weekend. I Father's Day, took my dad out for buffet lunch. It's his favorite. And when we're leaving, we got up from the table and he dropped something. Now, and he's a little bit slow moving and he's starting to bend down to pick it up. And I noticed the young woman behind him who was clearing the table behind him. So she was tearing it down. She stopped that, ran over, picked up what he dropped and gave it to him. Now, I'm sure that's not in her job description, but it made an impression on me about great customer service here.
Yeah.
How can we get more people doing that and seeing past, oh, well, that's not in my job description. I don't have to do that.
That's a personal note. I know somebody very close to me, and I won't mention who because I don't want it to be about whoever the company is, who works in the exact opposite type of organization, right? Who works in healthcare and in a situation where it's the exact thing that you just mentioned. It's like, that's not my job. And even when it is their job, they're like, I don't want, it's horrible. It's horrible. I wouldn't last a week in that culture. On the positive side, your question reminds me of something I read a while ago, and I hope I remember the details specifically, but I think it was a story about Steve Wynn, and he had witnessed, I think, like a pre-shift meeting, I think at the Four Seasons. It might not have been, but let's just say it was the Four Seasons. And every pre-shift meeting, somebody would come up and they'd tell a story of somebody they helped that day, a guest. Oh, this guest left their luggage and the thing, and I figured out how to find them at the airport, like something like that, right? And it created this culture that was just based on, I want to tell that story. I want to have, like, it rewarded people intrinsically. Like I don't know if they got bonuses for that. It was just more about like, hey, and they put those, I think they put the stories on the wall. There was like it was systematized. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't like, well, in this location they do it, and not in that location. And so I think those kinds of stories where you go, and I'll give you another example. I don't know if you have Trader Joe's up where you live, but we have, okay, so you're familiar with Trader Joe's. Now, you might not like Trader Joe's, the products or the food that they have there available, but every time I've gone into a Trader Joe's, and I've gone to like probably a dozen of them, of the places I've lived, the people, the cashiers, people there, everybody there's nice. Everybody's friendly. Everybody's like happy to help you. That's Trader Joe. That's retail. That's grocery work. Like that, I'm not putting it down. That's really important work. But like when you go into another place, do you get the same? I'll go into the other place in town. There's something they're doing, right? Is it the brand? Is it Trader Joe's? It's cool. It attracts the right people, maybe. But I guarantee you there's something systemic that Trader Joe's does and Four Seasons does, and that really says, okay, this is the intrinsic aspect of what makes somebody show up every day and care. So how can we tap into that intentionally and reward that and recognize that in people so that they show up and their job actually means something to them?
Powerful question to consider for any business leader. Marcus, for people who would like to know more about you and your service, they can find you through your website, marcusschaller.com, and you can find that link in the description below. Who are the people you can be most helpful? Who's your avatar?
Yeah, that's a great question. I work primarily with entrepreneurs, and that could be people who essentially sell expertise, right? So consultants, coaches, trainers, creatives, right? Who have hit a plateau in their business. And what I help them do is really figure out how to fine-tune their marketing so they can get unstuck and then they can start attracting more of their ideal customers and start growing again.
Marcus, as we prepare to wrap up, if you were talking to a business leader of a medium-sized business and giving them advice about 1, 2, or 3 changes or activities that they can do to get their people aligned and actually caring and wanting to show up for work so that they can help their customers, what would that be, that 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice?
The first would be make sure that you've built in a frequent touch points with your team. I've seen it too many times where, it might be a monthly thing, even sometimes it's even just a yearly thing. They do their annual review or something like that. Marcus Buckingham has this book that I think it's the 9 Myths of Business or something like that. But they talk about, like, if you have too many people on your team to do a one-on-one, at least for 15 minutes every week, then that means you have too many people on your team. And I love that, because if you think about it, if you're connecting with people on your team every week, and it's not just about what you need to achieve next week, but it's like, hey, what's going on? How's everything going? Do you need anything? Just understanding where they're at. That communication, and people, what do people want more than anything? They want to be seen. They want to be heard. And if you can do that in a authentic, legitimate way, I can't measure the results of what it be. I can't say it will improve by 48%, whatever, but I can't imagine that it wouldn't have a significant impact. The other is, and it relates to communication, is really making sure that people understand where you're heading. There's probably very few things more frustrating than for people in a team, large or otherwise, who don't know, where are we going with this? What's the point of all this stuff? And, if you're not communicating as a leader to your team of where we're heading, here are the challenges we're facing, here's what's going, warts and all kind of thing. It's not all just happy faces. Hey, here's the thing we're challenged with. Here's what's going on. And, in a day and age where people get laid off in a moment's notice simply because there's, some in the horizon, potentially some difficult economic news going on, I think that's what people remember, is just like how out of the loop they are. And they can't help to really diminish people's kind of internal motivation to really show up every day.
Powerful advice. My guest today is Marcus Schaller, reminding you that if you recognize people, they will show up and care. If you like what you heard, tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.